They get this very strong sense, particularly working class people, that the things that they enjoy, whether that's their faith or sports or all these things, right? They're somehow the elites on the coast and who control the media and the culture look down their nose at them and sneer at them. And then finally they had with Trump someone who was completely unashamed. Culturally, he really is a man of the people. Hello everyone, welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. It's Tuesday, October the 22nd, 2 weeks before Election Day. And we opened this episode with breaking news about where I went for lunch yesterday. If you follow me on social media, you will see that yesterday I went for lunch at McDonald's. Why did I go for lunch at McDonald's? Well, you know why. Because Trump went to McDonald's over the weekend in what has been described as the greatest political stunt of all time. But actually, it's more than a stunt. It's actually not just an incredibly effective campaign stop, and we all saw the videos on social media and so on. It actually says a lot about this election, about where we are with politics in America, and I want to get into all of that. But I do want to say something personal, which is, like President Trump, I really do love McDonald's. I've been going to McDonald's all my life, and I have actually worked at McDonald's. I worked there when I was a kid back in the day in England. And then later on, when I started a company, a consulting firm called Good Business, McDonald's was one of our clients, and I got to know the company really well. So I really am a huge McDonald's fan. And so it wasn't just yesterday that I went to McDonald's. I go there every now and again. I think of it as a treat. And it was an extra special treat to be able to go there in honor of the amazing role that it's played in this election campaign. And so first of all, we got to say, isn't it hilarious how the left and the media have just sort of completely lost their minds over this, in many ways, very innocuous, rather charming political thing that happened. Have you seen this on all the social media and some of the news shows? They're saying it was staged. Oh, yeah, because people really thought that when Donald Trump walked into that McDonald's and he said, "I'm looking for a job. I want to work at McDonald's. I love McDonald's, but I've never worked there. Please, do you have a job?" That he was really serious and he was trying to pretend that he was actually working. Of course it was staged. It's an election campaign. Everything is staged. That's what it is. It's a campaign. You go and visit places and people come and it tells people something that you want them to know about you and about your policies and all the rest of it. Of course, I mean, to attack this because it was staged is the most hilariously revealing thing, because it shows how completely they've lost their minds. They just can't even make sense when they're talking about President Trump. The other one that really got me, actually, that was so unbelievable, is Tim Walz, who's obviously, as each day of this campaign goes on, declining in stature and is completely revealed as a completely shallow and preposterous figure, actually, making no impact on the campaign other than in a negative sense. Every now and again he pops up and is a bit embarrassing. And he was on The View and he criticized it and said again it was staged and all the rest of it. But then he went on to say that what President Trump did by going to that McDonald's and working there for a little bit was demeaning to McDonald's workers. And he specifically said that showing up there and putting it, his red tie. What is demeaning about it? It's the opposite of demeaning. It's respectful. He went there and he said, "These are good jobs. I want to support you. I support McDonald's." And the fact, by the way, that he showed up in exactly what he wears everywhere else, the suit and the white shirt and the red tie, and then put the apron on, isn't that exactly why so many people love President Trump? Because he's completely authentic. He doesn't pander. He didn't kind of show up there pretending to wear some kind of casual gear in order to pander to the workers and in some sort of fantasy of what they might imagine him wanting to be dressed like. No, that's what Tim Walz would do. That's what a cynical, fake politician like Tim Walz or Kamala Harris, that's what they would do. Pander to the people in a setup like this. But President Trump just goes there and treats everyone the same and is the same person wherever he goes. And that authenticity is why he's so incredibly successful. So the criticisms of this have been completely ludicrous. But actually, what I wanted to say was that behind the incredible success of it as a kind of, campaign moment, just the fact that it got so much attention and showed Trump in a positive light, in a warm, human way, the way he was interacting with the workers, the way he was interacting with the customers, making jokes as he's handing them their stuff, saying, here it is, it's from Trump, I made it myself, just funny. And so apart from the sheer kind of in the moment success of it, it tells you something, I think, really profound about American politics. And there's two things in particular that I want to highlight. One of them goes back to something, and I'm so pleased that I'm really excited with this. The McDonald's thing has kind of, taken over the campaign, actually, because if you watch what I've been saying about Trump right back in the early days, right back in 2016, I've said very consistently that one of the main reasons the elites hate President Trump is sheer condescending snobbery. It's almost aesthetic. He's not to their taste. They find him vulgar and gross. And one of the main things, I said this, right from the beginning, they hate the fact that he likes McDonald's. Because in the elitist worldview, you're supposed to hate McDonald's, look to sneer at McDonald's. Oh, that's terrible. Junk food, disgusting. And even if you like, burgers, you would never go to McDonald's. You go to some artisan burger, whatever. That elitist worldview that really condemned Trump right from the get-go. I think the snobbery factor is such a big part of it. The fact that the way he dresses and looks and speaks and furnishes his homes and all that stuff, right? They find him vulgar, and the fact that he likes McDonald's was a central part of it. I mean, do you remember how they flipped out when I think it was in the pandemic, and he had sports teams visiting the White House, and he served them McDonald's, and they just said, how disgusting, how gross, and whatever. And no, I mean, it's just who he is, and that's why people really like him. But the fact that the elites took against him from day one, I think the McDonald's thing is a really, really big part of it. And so it captures, I think, why he's had this grip on the public imagination in America, because people know that the elites look down on them, and they get this very strong sense, particularly working class people in America, that they're, the things that they enjoy, whether that's their faith or sports or all these things, right? They're somehow the elites on the coast and who control the media and the culture look down their nose at them and sneer at them. And then finally they had with Trump someone who was completely unashamed. And even though this is why everyone says, oh, he's a billionaire, how can he possibly connect to working people? Because culturally, he really is a man of the people. He really is, culturally. That's how he's wired. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact, and I said this right from the beginning, is that the business in which he made his money. Okay, later on he became well known, did very well in the media industry with The Apprentice and so on. But he made his money in construction. And that's a business I know very well. My stepfather was a general contractor, nothing on the scale of Trump, not by a long way. He built, he did renovations and built, a couple of houses here and there. And when I was a kid, I would go on construction sites. And in my gap year between school and Oxford University, I worked for a construction company in London. So I spent a lot of time on construction sites. And when you're on construction sites, you have to get along with everybody. And that's how he came up. And so he has that connection. And that's why when, my friend Gloria Romero from Golden Together, who now obviously left the Democratic Party, as you remember, she was the former majority leader for the Democrats in the state Senate in California, now left the Democratic Party, became a Republican and Trump supporter, spoke at the Coachella rally a couple of weeks ago and described Trump as the blue-collar billionaire who was attracting the support of working people. So I think this all ties together. So the McDonald's thing actually captured that, the two sides of that argument, the elite condescension towards Trump and his movement and his supporters, but the fact that Trump's, relentless and consistent behavior, personality, the things he's been so strong about all along, including absolutely getting the culture of regular Americans and not being embarrassed about it and not looking down his nose at it. And finally, people could feel there's a politician who doesn't just look down their nose and sneer at them. And so I think that's a huge, huge part of Trump's appeal. And then the second important point I wanted to make that arises from this McDonald's thing is the working class point specifically, and just think about the contempt that people, again, in the elite, and in the policy-making classes often show for those kinds of jobs, right? They call it McJobs and so on, dismissing that kind of work. But actually, and in fact, McDonald's themselves, and again, I've worked with the company, so I know how sincere they are about this. They pride themselves on the fact that a job at McDonald's, particularly if you're younger, is an incredibly good experience. I mean, I learned a lot when I worked there. It was just, the discipline of work and so on. I was a kid, it's just a few, hours here and there and holidays and so on. But I learned things. My kids laugh at me now because I go on about it when I'm, cooking at home. I tend to cook in our family. And I always have this thing that I literally learned at McDonald's, which is clean as you go. This kind of, constantly cleaning up and not leaving a mess and coming back and doing it later. It's as clean as you go. I learned that at McDonald's. So all these things that are really, it may seem simple and ridiculous, but actually it really is, in the words of the McDonald's marketing campaign, they want their aspiration was to be America's best first job. And so they're not saying it's the most amazing thing you could possibly do, but it's a fantastic, great opportunity, hard work. You learn a lot, good training, and so on. So these are, and to be patronizing about that and dismiss that is just so wrong. And so by going to McDonald's and connecting with the workers there, I think he solidifies also not just the cultural connection he has, but this new orientation of the Republican Party as the workers' party, which is a massive transformation. I mean, it is the biggest political shift that we've seen in, I don't know, how far do you want to go back? 100 years? I guess in America, you could say the last really big shift politically was, so maybe not quite 100 years, the last really big shift politically was the Nixon Southern strategy, where the Southern states flipped from Democrat to Republican, totally reorienting the political map. This is the biggest change since then, and it's in a way more significant because it's not just in one part of the country, it's throughout the country. The demographic shift where the Republican Party is now the working class party. And that is exactly as I said from the beginning, that in 2016 with Trump and Brexit, actually that happened in the UK, looking at all of that and the kinds of people that were rallying to this message of what I described as positive populism, lifting up the working class, opportunity for people who'd been left behind after 5 decades of elitist policymaking, that the Republican Party had the opportunity, that's how I put it, the opportunity to become a multiracial working class coalition. Well, now that's happened. It's basically happened because Trump's been the leader for all this time, and the establishment tried to kick him out, and the Democrats and the media all trying to force him out, but he stayed there, the leader of the Republican Party. So that orientation has really been confirmed. The selection of J.D. Vance as his running mate. That's why that was so important ideologically as well, is that you now have a party that is completely transformed. And you see it in the numbers supporting Trump and other Republican candidates across the board. It is working class people of all races and backgrounds. And that is incredibly important for the future of politics because, of course, that group is going to be a growing group. And so it's not just this whole McDonald's thing this weekend wasn't just a fun piece of campaign, activity. It definitely was that. It actually had some really deep lessons to teach us about what's going on in American politics. And I think the fact that those lessons are positive for Republicans is exactly why you saw the insane and ridiculous freakout from Democrats and the media. Joining us now, one of the most exciting races going on in the whole country. We're all talking, I know, across the national media about Trump and Harris and all the rest of it. But as far as I'm concerned, our guest today, who you know well if you're a regular of this show, is going to deliver one of the biggest and most important upsets. That is Nathan Hochman, running for District Attorney, Los Angeles County. We hope about to dump George Gascón into the history books. How's it going, Nathan? Tell us the latest on your race.
You know what? So far, so good. The three major metrics that you can evaluate a campaign, whether it's fundraising, endorsements, or polling, I got to say we're in the position that we were hoping to be at this point in the race. Fundraising, the record for a DA's race was $1.1 million. We smashed the record. You actually can't raise and spend more than $2.511 million. We hit that mark at the end of September. And the number is good, but it represents over 5,000 individual contributions, half Republicans, half Democrats, in amounts from $5 to $1,500, and from the entire county. So fundraising is giving us the ability to get out on TV, radio, social media, text with video, email, throwing leaflets from planes, whatever it takes to reach.
Are you literally doing that? Are you throwing leaflets from planes?
No, that was a question I asked the marketers. Can we actually throw leaflets from planes? No, we were not going to burn a few forests and do that. But we are reaching.
I love the energy, though. I love the fact that that's how you're seeing it.
But we're going to reach 3.7 million people, and and we're doing it. It's very interesting because Gascón has been singularly ineffective in raising money. As of September 17th, he only had $46,000 cash on hand against our $2.511 million. So far, so good on that. On endorsements, we have over 500 endorsements, including over 320 of them from his own deputy district attorneys, who have basically completely rebelled against their boss. And they've been willing to publicly put their name out there, which is quite brave, because Gascón has a history of retaliating against people who stand in his way, which is why he's facing 20 retaliation lawsuits. And we also have over 70 elected city leaders, half Democrat, half Republican, from the 88 cities in LA County. We have all the business leaders. We have the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the BizFed PAC, Hollywood Chamber of Commerce. We got people like Rick Caruso who come in big time for my campaign, which is greatly appreciated. And then we got polling. The LA Times came out with a poll about 2 weeks ago. And granted, I had to renew my subscription to the LA Times to see it because they have not written a critical editorial about Gascón in 3.5 years. In fact, they endorsed him in this race. But their poll was very revealing. It shows that we're 30 points ahead, which is a reflection both of the deep unpopularity of Gascón across the entire political, demographic, and geographic divides, and the hope that people have in my campaign that I can take my 34 years of prosecutorial and defense experience, implement a hard work middle agenda of accountability, proportional accountability to criminals, and emphasize deterrence over filling the prisons as the means of how we get there.
So let's just look at the aspect of that you just ended with, which is that how are you going to make a difference? Because it feels to me as if, as you say, everything's going well, and you hear reports from friends of mine in LA, so, and I'm there often, and you see your signs everywhere. So there's a real energy for change, and it's really interesting to see how cross-party it is. You've got support from Democrats as well as Republicans, and that's just great to see. People want change. What is the change that you can offer, and how quickly can you make a difference if you win the race on November the 5th? Obviously, in California, it doesn't end there. We've got weeks and weeks of counting and so on. When would you take office, and how quickly can you actually start to change things?
So you actually take office the first Monday of December, which this year is December 2nd. And as far as change goes, that's where the enormous power of the DA will come into bear. Gascón sort of proved that on his first day, first hour, first email, when he issued 9 special directives that changed the course of criminal justice in LA County in favor of criminals and away from victims. But just as quickly, I can do something that Gascón completely failed to do, which is have all the prosecutors, a consensus of those 750 prosecutors standing next to me, have tens of thousands of law enforcement officers. I've gotten the endorsements of all our unions standing next to me, having victims groups that Gascón has totally abandoned standing next to me, and eliminate his pro-criminal extreme policies on day one. Those are policies that say to juveniles that you can steal under $950 and nothing's going to happen to you. They say to people who want to use a gun during a violent crime that if you use it, you're not going to get the gun enhancement. They say to gangs that if you want to operate as a gang and commit a violent crime, the DA's office is not going to go against you. I can eliminate those prohibitions and go back not to mass incarceration, of course. That's an extreme policy that also didn't work. But go back to this hard middle approach that basically says we're going to look at each case individually, each individual defendant, the defendant's background, the crime committed, and the impact on the victim to determine who the true threats are to our public safety. And those are often the repeat offenders, and they need to go to jail. But also the nonviolent first-time offenders still have to pay a debt to society, But that's where non-prison proportional alternatives come into play, like community service, restitution, pay it back if you stole something. Or if you're suffering from a serious drug addiction, we'll give you a choice. Here's a diversion program. You can either go to prison or you can go through an 18-month rehab program one day at a time. And if you make it to the other end, we'll give you a certificate and wipe your record clean of that crime. So I can implement that on day one and do it with the consensus of the stakeholders in the system and really begin to change the culture of lawlessness into a culture of lawfulness.
And then you mentioned some of those things in terms of rehabilitation and the sentencing and so on, the charging. I mean, there's obviously an interplay with the other big one in relation to crime and public safety that's on the ballot this November, apart from your race in Los Angeles, which is Prop 36 in California. What is the interplay between what you're hoping to do? And again, I mean, that's another race where you've got very big margins in favor of passage of the yes vote. Seems to be cruising to victory there. Let's assume that it's a yes on 36 and that becomes the law. How does that connect with your plans?
So Proposition 36 will give DAs, and we're hoping, like myself, additional tools to especially go after repeat offenders and fentanyl poisoners. With repeat offenders, right now you can commit a misdemeanor theft under $950 every day for a whole year or years, and it never becomes a felony. Proposition 36 says when you get convicted the third time, the judge has the right to put you in state prison as a felon. Same thing with drug use. Right now, drug use is a misdemeanor, and you can use meth, heroin, fentanyl every day forever, and it never becomes a felony. Proposition 36 says if you get convicted on your third time, it's treatment eligible, which means the judge can order you into treatment. The fourth time can actually order you into prison. So it strikes at the balance to really go after the repeat offenders who, they say that 20% of the criminals are committing 60% of the crimes. So if you can go after the repeat offenders and have those tools to do it, you're really going to take a huge, chunk out of crime in your community. And then it also gives tools to go after those fentanyl poisoners. And I don't call them drug dealers because they're not. They're dealing poison. And these additional tools help go after them as well.
I mean, I'm very much for Prop 36, and we've talked about it many times on this show. I mean, could you make a big difference even without Prop 36 passing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, right now, Gascón has literally policies that say, for instance, if you go into a homeless encampment and an officer sees someone using meth, heroin, fentanyl right in his presence, those are misdemeanor drug crimes, and Gascón has an explicit policy saying he will not allow his prosecutors to prosecute those crimes. The same thing with criminal threats, disorderly conduct, trespass, loitering for prostitution. His policies say even though they are laws on the books, and the police in other counties have certainly arrested people for them in order to deal with this problem, in LA County, the DA's office says he will not prosecute them. So even if somehow Proposition 36 does not pass, if I go back to prosecuting or allowing officers in this hard middle approach to prosecute these quality of life crimes, all of a sudden law enforcement becomes a partner again in trying to solve the epidemic problem we're facing of homelessness and a whole variety of crimes in our society. And so, yes, I can actually accomplish a lot, even if Proposition 36 were not to pass.
What about there's a new police chief in LA, is that right?
Jim McDonald.
Is that the city? You've got the sheriff there. I mean, I'd love you to talk a little bit about about the way that this works as a team in terms of public safety and law enforcement, the DA's office and the police department and the sheriff's department.
Sure. So the DA's office is a county-wide position. That means there's 88 cities in LA County. There's 125 unincorporated areas. A county-wide position like the DA or the sheriff actually has jurisdiction over everything. Then within LA, within those 88 cities, obviously the big elephant in the room is LA City itself. LA City, for instance, has its own city attorney that does misdemeanors and civil cases. It has its own police department, the LAPD. A lot of the 88 cities have their own police departments, and some of the cities actually have their own city attorney's offices. But you got to actually have a coordinated approach, and that's where Gascón has utterly failed. He's not been working with the sheriff's department. He's not been working with LAPD, and he certainly hasn't been working with all the local police officer organizations as well, which is in large part why I have all their endorsements. So I will have to and want to work with the key partners in going after crime. Because the DA's office, it doesn't actually do the investigation out in the field. That's to the police. They build up the case, they gather the evidence, they talk to the witnesses, and then they present their investigative report and all the exhibits to the DA's office to prosecute in court. The DA's office makes the determination of who gets prosecuted, what they get prosecuted for, and ultimately is in charge if the case goes to trial of trying that case to a jury, and then helping defend it on appeal to get a conviction. So the DA's office has to have great relations with law enforcement in order to really send a strong message to criminals that everyone's back to doing their job. And that's the message we need to send. Because my goal, quite candidly, is to deter criminals from committing crimes in the first place, because they understand that the laws are now going to be enforced rather than necessarily filling the prisons to the breaking point.
And the thing that's important about what you've just said, that deterrence effect, is that it works the other way. I mean, this is anecdotal, but it's an important anecdote where we have had reports of hardened gang members in jail, for example, literally citing George Gascón as their ally. They're highly aware, highly attuned to what's going on in the DA's apartment. These hardened criminals. That's right, isn't it?
I mean, there are reports that the convicted murderers, when they found out Gascón was going to lighten their sentence, were so happy that they said, I'm going to tattoo his name on my forehead. And I can assure you that there will be no convicted murderer that ever wants to tattoo the name Hochman on their forehead. But it's also, unfortunately, the criminals have really been paying attention to Gascón's policies. You might have seen on social media that there were 50 12 to 15-year-olds that were recently seen biking to a 7-Eleven, dropping their bikes outside, ransacking the store, filling their pants with stuff that they had stolen and biking out. That's because they know that George Gascón doesn't prosecute people under 18 stealing $950. But that is a very dangerous mindset to put out there in young people. And the laws aren't laws anymore. They're actually just suggestions. Follow a suggestion, don't follow a suggestion, but there's no consequences if you don't follow a suggestion. And if that's their mindset in their teenage years, when they hit their 20s and 30s, God help us.
I really agree. I was going to raise that one, actually, because two of the most visible things you see often on social media are those kinds of crimes, the flash mob hitting a retail store, and also the street takeovers. And both of them together, they just create this sense of lawlessness and anything goes. Could you talk a little bit about the cars and the street takeovers and all of that?
So you're right. And it's mostly juveniles. What they'll do is they'll pick an intersection, usually in the early morning hours, 1, 2, 3 a.m. 40 cars will show up. They'll close down the intersection. They'll get a whole lot of people watching. Then the cars basically do their slides and their spin outs for everybody's amusement, sometimes actually hurting people. Then very often what you'll find is that there's an AutoZone or a 7-Eleven or some type of store that's nearby. And what we've seen is that they then turn their attention to those stores, ransack the stores, run out, and the next thing you know, we got more social media video going on what's going out there. But these are solvable problems. What I just described are a series of misdemeanor violations that George Gascón is not prosecuting, but absolutely can be prosecuted. And you can even go beyond that. There's laws on the books that allow you to impound cars involved in these street takeovers. And when someone wants to get their car back, they're going to pay a lot of fees or impound fees and charges related to that street takeover. So if you end up putting someone through the criminal justice system, they don't have to necessarily go to state prison. Going through the criminal justice system might send a strong message to a first-time nonviolent offender and impound their cars. I venture to say that deterrence will come into play once everyone knows that this will be the consequence, and you'll have a whole lot less street takeovers going forward in the future.
So great. I mean, this is why I think it's. I've said this before when we've had these conversations. I think compared to most elections, I think the difference that you can make will be so, quick. because it's just sending such a message so clearly. And we know, because they've said so, that you're going to have, or you're going to have the whole team approach all lining up behind you, because this is what the rest of the law enforcement world has been wanting. Certainly the police department, I guess the officers would say the reason that people say, well, why don't the police go in and do something? And because they've been so demoralized and undermined, when they know that nothing's going to happen, why would they bother?
And that's just it. Take a homeless encampment situation. If the police want to enter it and someone is strung out on meth and comes at them, the police officer is going to have to make a quick decision on what level of force to use, knowing that everybody's videotaping it with their cameras. And if he makes the wrong decision, all of a sudden that officer just put his career and his safety and maybe even his liberty and his job on the line to go ahead and enforce the law when he knows the DA's office isn't going to prosecute. So what you often find is an excuse that officers have been making for 3.5 years, that our hands are tied. When they're asking, why are you not investigating this theft in a store? Our hands are tied. Why are you not going into the homeless encampment and enforcing those laws? Our hands are tied. What I can assure you is that won't be the excuse going forward, because if law enforcement does its job and gives us cases that are beyond a reasonable doubt with legally admissible evidence, we will give every one of those cases a fair shake. And in doing so, it'll send a very serious message to criminals that the laws are back to being enforced. If you want to go and experience the consequences, commit the crime, but otherwise just don't do the crime. And the target era I'm shooting for is not the 60s or the 70s. It's actually 2014, because that was considered our safest year in the last 50 years. And in that year, the DA was doing her job, law enforcement was doing its job. Victims understood if you dialed 911, not only would someone pick up the phone, but you could get justice for the harm you suffered. And as importantly, the criminals understood that the lines were being enforced fairly, consistently, impartially, with real consequences on the other side. And in record numbers, they weren't committing crimes that year, saving a lot of victims in the process.
I'm so glad you said that, because it echoes a message that I'm on the road a lot supporting various candidates across the state. And I make the point about how rapidly things seem to have fallen apart in California when you've had these far left policies. It wasn't that long ago that things were, going the way we wanted them to do. And therefore, we can get it back to that pretty quickly. Nathan, I'm sure you're very busy on the campaign trail, but it feels like it's going to be nothing compared to when you're actually in there doing the job. Then the real work starts, right?
Day one is what you dream about. It'll be a great day one, but as you just said, that's just the beginning of the work. The hole is big that Gascón has dug for us, but these are solvable situations and solvable problems. I mean, we can't cure cancer in a day. We can't cure climate change, but we can actually restore that culture of lawfulness and then keep that message consistent to the criminals, build up the resources of law enforcement, again, at the prosecutor's office and with the police and the sheriffs, really be the champion of victims again, and send an unmistakable message out there in society that the laws count, accountability actually matters, but we'll also do real and effective criminal justice reform as well as prioritizing our safety.
Brilliant. Nathan, in these last few weeks, if people want to get involved and support you, where should they go?
A good starting place is the website. It's Nathan Hochman, HOCHMAN.com. From there, you can hook up to all the social media, whether it's Meta, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, X, and then get the word out. Because if everyone here can get the word out to their family, their friends, their neighbors, their social media, then we can really win this election by a large margin and send a very clear mandate and message to the public that LA County is back.
I agree. And that's why this is so important. Everyone watching or listening outside of California, outside of LA, this is an important race for you as well. So if you haven't supported Nathan already, I urge you to do so. Nathan, great to see you. Hopefully next time as DA Hochman.
That'd be fantastic. And Steve, your show is always one of the most fun shows to come on. Your questions are always excellent. So thank you again.
Of course. Great to see you. Thanks.
Great to see you.
And here for California Corner, our friend Susan Shelley, fresh from our triumphant voter guide episode. I got such great feedback on that. Thank you, Susan, for being part of that. Here's something we're going to start with today, which I think using the word following is overstating it. I've been seeing developments in this topic that we're going to get into a really deep conversation on because it's complicated and needs explanation. But I don't fully understand it. And the reason it's timely and relevant is because very soon after the election, 3 days after the election, the California Air Resources Board, CARB, is going to be voting on something that directly affects our gas prices and so on. And it's all mired in secrecy and bureaucratic shenanigans. And here you are to explain it all to us. So tell us what's going on, Susan.
Well, we have a festival of finger pointing in Sacramento after the California Air Resources Board announced that they were going to implement a regulation or an update to a regulation that was going to raise gasoline prices by an estimated 47 cents a gallon starting in January. And people got upset about this.
This year, January 2025.
January 2025. And people got upset about this, and it began to have political repercussions to the point where the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Pro Tem, Mike McGuire, issued a stern statement from his office to be attributed to him personally that said, if CARB does anything that's against the interest of consumers, why the legislature, which created CARB and which approves its budget and which appoints its or approves its appointees to the board, why there will be consequences. But of course there will not be consequences, because this is a regulatory board that is implementing the idiotic laws that the legislature has been passing and the governors, plural, have been signing since about 2006. And essentially what's going on here is California decided it was going to single-handedly end climate change by taxing the people of California to death. That's basically what we've got. One of these things is called the low carbon fuel standard. And the way this works is companies that make things like biofuels, which are fairly useless, have credits to sell to companies that make high carbon density fuels like petroleum-based fuels. And so they have this credit trading that they created. They think they've made a market in credits, but it's obviously all just government mandates of one kind or another. And oil companies have to buy credits from biofuel types of companies because that's low carbon density, and the oil companies are high carbon density. So for the sin of being high carbon density, they have to pay these useless fuel companies, or experimental or new or whatever you want to call them, that have low carbon density. And there's probably more money to be made creating the credits than selling the fuels. So that's why an update to this regulation is going to raise prices. Because the more they try to drive down the density of carbon in California in fuels, the more the oil companies have to pay to the biofuel types of companies, and then that gets passed on. There's no hard and fast number. It's all going to be on this so-called market negotiation, but whatever they decide in the regulation is going to cost California consumers more in January.
Got it. So this is effectively it's a tax on the oil companies. That's what it is. It's like they have to pay more. So to me, this is very reminiscent of so much else that we see in California that we could call them stealth taxes. We hear about wealth taxes. These are stealth taxes. They do it stealthily. A great example, terrible, but big example, we've talked about often and I focused on a lot, is when it comes to housing and homes and the construction of homes. Why are they the most why housing costs the most expensive here in California, in the whole country? Because of the stealth taxes on house building. They're called impact fees. No one ever sees them, but when you add them up, the typical home unit in California has $150,000, $200,000 per unit of impact fees, which is taxes paid to state agencies and governments and local governments as well. So this is another example of that. So this is basically a tax on oil companies, only they've created this setup where the money goes directly to they tax a villain company and take the money and hand it to an approved company. That's basically what's going on here.
Exactly. That's exactly what's going on.
And 2006, what's the significance of that? What was passed then?
That was AB 32, Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. And this is what allowed CARB to set up the cap and trade program and other things that supposedly are how they're going to enforce this mandatory reduction in greenhouse gases in California. And it's all really arbitrary how they calculate what these greenhouse gas levels are. I think they have to go 40 or 50% below 1990 levels. Well, how do they know what the 1990 level was? How do they know when they're 40% below it? And what's it going to cost to achieve this? And most importantly, what does it achieve? It achieves nothing. No one will tell you in California government that this fixes climate change. It has no effect on the global climate whatsoever. It's just California.
I know that usually the argument they make is, well, it's leadership, right? We have to lead, but it's not leadership. If it's one of my favorite quotes, actually. It was John Boehner of all people when he was speaker, and he was saying how he couldn't make anything happen because of the people in his caucus, and he couldn't do anything. And he said, when you're a leader without any followers, you're just a guy who's out taking a walk. Which I thought was a lovely quote.
California,
and it's a bit like that with this, right? So no one else is doing this stuff, right? We're not leading anything.
It's very expensive. And California has high gasoline prices because of this, because of cap and trade, because of low carbon fuel standard, all run through the California Air Resources Board, through these mystical revelations that they have about what they need to do to reduce global greenhouse gases.
So the cap and trade, which you mentioned, that's separate, right? That's not what we're talking about here. Maybe we can come to that in a second. But this is the low carbon fuel standard, which also came out of the 2006 Act.
I believe so. It may have come later, but I think it's a regulatory creation by CARB. I don't think it was specifically named by the legislature, but I might be wrong about that.
Right. So why is this relevant now? What are they doing so imminently?
Well, they have to update these regulations from time to time to try and meet these ever-evolving, ever-tightening targets. And so it's a big mystery. It's like some ancient fictional temple where they go in and they have incense, and they're trying to figure out what the mystical number will be for each of these fuels, and what is the density, and what is the requirement, and how are they going to reach their targets, which are arbitrary from the legislature and could be paused and could be repealed. And if we did that, and we didn't have these targets, like other states don't have these targets, we wouldn't have this constant driving toward higher prices of electricity and gasoline. And that really, I think, is the answer. We have to pause the enforcement of these targets until we see what the cost is and what the effect is on the people of California.
But they're voting. When they have a vote, I mean, what's the process? How does this go down, and what's happening in the next few weeks?
Well, the staff is making recommendations, and on November 8th, I think it is, the California Air Resources Board is scheduled to vote on approving these new updates to the regulations, and then that will be implemented and enforced on the various energy companies, and they will end up paying more for essentially running their companies.
And where does the 4 cents per gallon come from?
It's anybody's guess. Nobody knows how they come up with these numbers. It's all a guess.
Is that their number that they've put out there as a potential?
I believe they put it out as an estimate in September, and then they withdrew it.
Right.
And everybody said, well, what's the new number? And they said, we can't say right now.
So it's their number. This is not... Okay.
Right. It's an estimated number from the regulators. They have to account for the cost of their regulations. Everything in the law says they have to be cost effective. And the way that they do this is kind of sneaky. What I've seen them do is they essentially say that there are these incredibly costly health impacts of not doing this. And then once you say it's going to kill somebody, even if you can't prove that it is killing anybody, but once you say it is, then the value of human life is such that no matter what the regulation costs, it meets their cost-effective standard.
That's brilliant. So I thank you. I remember learning about this in economics back in the day in Oxford. We had a course called Public Economics, and there was a section of the class called Cost Benefit Analysis, and it was about how governments do this stuff. And it has to be done. And I remember literally learning about the valuation of human life. And I remember the tutor saying, well, it can be a bit, it's not a particularly nice thing to think about, but, we have to take account of these things. I remember the example that was given was in terms of road construction and where you put the money for financing new roads. And the argument was, if you put more money into expanding and improving existing roads in urban areas and things like that, then you'll have more traffic and there'll be more accidents, but those kinds of roads, people travel at lower speeds, so they're less likely to be fatal. Whereas if you build freeways, you're going to have higher speeds, fewer accidents, but the accidents you do have are more likely to be fatal. And so this is how you have to calculate everything. And so you have a number that you put into the calculation for the valuation of a human life. And I remember at that time, for example, the UK Department of Transportation, the actual number for the valuation of a human life was £144,000. Call it $200,000. That was like real. And the point about the reason I tell this story is that what we studied was you can make that number whatever you want, based on whatever assumptions you put in and the process you use to value it. And there were all these different techniques that we learned as choices for how you put. So all this stuff is made up, it's not a real thing. And so now you've told me that, I can that sort of opened my eyes to, oh, I get it. This is just a bunch of bureaucrats and economists sitting around making it up in order to achieve what their ideological goal is.
Right. So they say they're trying to achieve greenhouse gas reduction for the climate, but as soon as they need to do cost effectiveness, they talk about air pollution, and they start saying, well, we calculate that X number of people will have asthma and will go to the emergency room, and this is how much an emergency room costs. And they multiply everything up, and they talk about health, not climate, but health. And then they ratchet up the cost to whatever they need to justify the insane cost of the regulation.
Incredibly important you've explained that, because that's how they do it, and this is, you've got to lift the curtain on this stuff because it's so hidden from the public view, and then they'll come out with some bland statement like scientific and econometric analysis has shown that. No, it's just a bunch of people making stuff up in order to make it work.
Exactly.
Another example of that is, I don't know if you and I have talked about it, but I talk about this the whole time, which is how they make their insane oil imports policy work. We now import, 70% of our oil in California. Used to be like around 10%. We could be basically providing for all our oil and gas needs from within the state, mostly from Kern County. And we're not doing that because of this war on it's not even a war on fossil fuels. It's a war on our fossil fuels, because we're not using any less. We're just importing it from Ecuador and Venezuela and Iran and Iraq on these giant super tankers fueled by bunker fuel, which is the dirtiest and worst and most polluting fuel, instead of in a nice clean pipeline from Bakersfield to the refineries in LA. No, we're not doing that. We're bringing them on these ships. And to make the whole stupid scheme work, CARB doesn't count the carbon emissions from these super tankers as they travel halfway across the world until they are 12 miles off the coast of California. And that's how they make it work. And so
there you go.
Low emission.
And what they've done to the trucking industry, they have forced hundreds of billions of dollars of costs onto the economy by over-regulating and then re-regulating and then re-regulating again diesel engines. And they do it the same way. It doesn't matter what it costs, because they have a study, not necessarily a credible study, but they have a study that shows that it's going to kill everybody, and they multiply it up. And the fact that it isn't killing anybody doesn't work its way into the study
and
at all.
It's very important everyone understands that this is how it works inside of governments. And this is what, they say, well, the experts. And that's why we're right to be suspicious when they tell us it's the experts, because actually they're not experts. They're just dutifully implementing an ideological scheme. And that's what's going on here. So
and they're not accountable to anybody. They do whatever they want, and they're not accountable.
So tell me a little bit about you mentioned before we started taping the conversation that Ashley Zavala's great reporter, hounding the people in power in Sacramento all the time. She's been on the case with this story. What's going on there?
She is trying to find out from CARB what their standard is going to cost. And she's trying to get them to sit down for an interview and explain it. and they won't. They won't answer her questions. And this is a very interesting situation because it exposes the administrative state. That's what we have here. The legislature shifts all the blame to an agency. They take a photograph of themselves voting to save the climate, and then they shunt everything off to an administrative agency, which ratchets up the cost to whatever they decide to ratchet it up to. And then nobody's responsible for anything. The agency says, well, the legislature told us to do it. And the legislature says, well, it's the independent agency. We have no control over them. And that's all true. One of the things that was going to fix this was the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act. 1.4 million Californians signed petitions to put that on the ballot this November, this election. And the governor of California sued to have it taken off. And the state Supreme Court went along with them, and it's off the ballot. Now, what would it have done? It said that when an administrative agency enacts some kind of a fee or tax or whatever you want to call it, a charge, that it has to be voted on by an elected body. So in this case, the state legislature would have to vote on these regulations and these costs that CARB is imposing. And that just flipped out the governor. He did not want that to happen. And that's where we are.
I hadn't appreciated that connection. We talked about that a lot, and you were involved in it, of course, because of your role with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. And we've been talking about it for a while, and I hadn't, and I've really keyed into it in terms of local tax increases and the 2/3 majority required for, over 100 years and so on. But I hadn't made the connection with these stealth taxes. That's really important. I mean, I'm sure we talked about it at the time. I just hadn't appreciated.
This was one of the really important provisions in the Taxpayer Protection Act. There were many provisions in it, and this was one of the most important because essentially what it said is that you couldn't just have an agency ordering a fee on warehouses. Somebody who was elected had to sit down and look at the economic effect of that and vote on it and be accountable to the voters for that vote. What we have now is this public rulemaking process, which is mostly a sham. You have the staff creating these regulations, and then you have all of these various regulations going out for public comment, and all of the major economic forces in our economy, the oil companies, the utilities, the automakers, everybody has to go plead their case in public comments to these regulators, which they are free to disregard and then vote to implement these regulations that devastate the California economy and make everything more expensive for the consumer.
So the legislature, with things like the Global Warming Solutions Act, sets up these processes and and empowers these agencies, and then their actual activity, they have a free rein. They just go off and do it.
Exactly. They have to go through this process of rulemaking, which is very slow and very aggravating. And if you ever listen to any of these hearings, it's one of the most frustrating things. For example, we have this new rule for clean trucks. It's completely impractical. The idea is they're going to force all the cities, for instance, will have to change all of their vehicles to electric powered by a date certain. There is no infrastructure to charge these vehicles. It means that it's going to fall on all the local taxpayers to replace the vehicles. What is the point of it? What is the cost of it? What is the effect of it? Well, nobody cares because it's regulatory and they're meeting their imaginary standard for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which has, by the way, no effect on the climate.
And the reason it's so dangerous, again, from a sort of philosophical point of view, the reason this is so dangerous is that it's the opposite of how representative government should work, which is that you've got competing interests, right? That is just the reality of life. And everything is a bit of a balance. You want protection, but you want to overprotect so people can go about their life. Everything is like that. And that's the job of the elected representative, to balance things out and say, yeah, okay, we want to stop pollution. But I mean, let's say we want to stop pollution. Well, a very simple way of stopping pollution would be to shut down every single business, just close them all down. But then we wouldn't have an economy. We wouldn't have, so that's a sort of dumb example. But the point is that everything is a balance. And it's supposed to be the elected people accountable to the voters who strike that balance. And if they get it wrong, the voters can kick them out. Instead of which, you have this structure empowering these agencies who are completely monomaniacal. All they care about is their thing. So as far as they're concerned, it's all climate change, and that's the only consideration. And
That's right.
and there's nothing balancing it out. And that's why it should be the politicians in the end who make that judgment.
They don't
and
want to
they
be
don't.
accountable. They
They
don't
don't
want
wanna
to be
be.
accountable. They want to
It's a
shift all
really
the blame.
deep point, actually. I'm very glad we got into it. And just on that, the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act. So I remember from our conversations at the time, it was restoring protections that had been there but have been eroded by the courts and
Yes.
politicians over the years. But this point here about the fees and charges levied by agencies, is that a new protection that it was putting in?
Well, it depends, I suppose, on how you look at it and when you start the clock on what is new. It was always the case that the government had to be accountable for these charges that it was imposing on businesses. When did it become the case that everything was shifted to regulatory agencies? Perhaps it was 2006, maybe it was earlier. But we now have this situation that was not foreseen in the Constitution of California, where regulatory agencies have what amounts to a taxing power. That was not in the Constitution. So I would argue that having elected officials vote on these fees and charges is restoring the Constitution, not amending or revising the Constitution, but just restoring it to what was intended, that you have accountable government on all of these exactions.
Well, it's the age-old thing, isn't it? No taxation without representation. I mean, one of the oldest slogans in American history. I mean,
That's right.
in a way, the foundational slogan of
Right.
America, in a way, isn't it?
Yes.
That's
And
what it was about. The Tea Party, the whole thing, no taxation without representation.
Exactly. At the federal level, the Supreme Court of the United States has cut back the regulatory power. They reversed the Chevron decision that said
Yeah.
regulators are their own courts and can decide their own cases. They reversed that. And they had their major doctrines case about I forgot which case it was, but they had their major doctrine. Oh, that was the EPA and West Virginia coal decision, where the EPA had decided that it was essentially going to ban
All
coal-fired
types of power
electricity.
stations, yeah.
And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do something that has a major effect on the economy without the specific authorization of Congress. You can't just interpret it out of a little phrase in a subclause. You have to have specific authorization. Well, in California, we don't have that. We have the regulators just unleashed and doing whatever they want. And these are not little small charges. When you look at cap and trade and you look at the low carbon fuel standard, this is a huge impact on our economy. This is a major thing. This is not a fee for renewing your license plates. This is a huge, huge charge against you and your checking account and the whole California economy.
Well, that's why I was so stunned when I learned the scale of the impact fees on house building. And you look at, I mean, I remember the number for, and this is the 150,000 to 200,000 median number for a housing unit, $150,000, right? Let's just take the low end of that. Just right, that's just an absolutely straight up tax on the house or the apartment. Just
Exactly.
Of course, it just raises the price by that amount. That's an enormous amount. In San Francisco, it was $300,000 per apartment. And I always, when I make this point, not for the apartment building, but for the apartment unit, $300,000. This is huge. And so the broad point here is that, which I'm fully, signed up for and make this argument all the time, but this is just reinforcing it, exposing and cutting back this, whatever you want to call it, swamp, bureaucracy, administrative state, regulatory state in Sacramento is a huge, huge part of getting California back on track.
Absolutely, it is. It's probably the most important thing
Yeah.
that we could do is
Yeah.
to pause these targets, which are irrational and arbitrary. Pause the targets, and look at the cost that it is imposing on the people of California.
Yes,
Because
and it's insane.
it
And
is
these people
insane.
have no clue. I mean, just a small example, but there are hundreds like this on the electrification of vehicles point. So if people go to my social media at Steve Hilton X, just today or yesterday, we just posted this video of me just from the other week. I was in the Central Valley. I'm there all the time talking to the farmers and learning about what's going on there. Don't get me started on all of that. The water, we know. You can check out our policy document on water abundance, for example, at goldentogether.com. Anyway, the point I was going to make is I went and it's pistachio harvest time, lot of harvesting going on right now. And I'm just really interested to learn about how it all works. And so I went into the fields and I just saw the machine. I mean, it depends on the different crops, but the pistachio harvesting, it's a highly specialized equipment, highly specialized, based on the size of the trees and the width of the lanes between the trees. Lanes is probably the wrong word. I'll learn the right word. Anyway, you know what I mean. And it shakes the tree. It's amazing to watch, right? It shakes the tree and the nuts fall in and then they get processed and so on. So they want to electrify that. And so I said, okay, what's the impact of that? Just that piece of equipment. Well, it's just impossible. Now we can do a whole, field or a whole day and it's fine. And then we can refuel. But with this, first of all, the whole thing is going to be, twice or three times as big because you have to have the battery and it makes the whole thing bigger and clunkier and heavier. Maybe it doesn't even fit down. We have to replant everything. Then you can only go a certain distance on a charge, 5 times a day. It's going to have to go back somewhere. We don't know where, but to be recharged. I mean, it's just a total, massive disruption. And that's just like one thing, one pistachio of it. And you just think about that throughout the economy. It's completely mad what they're doing. And as you say, it's not even achieving its own goals. I mean, it's just so infuriating, but it's got to be stopped. But I mean, we keep saying it's got to be stopped. The only way it's going to be stopped is if we elect people who will stop it.
Right. And in order to do that, voters have to understand why they are paying the prices they are paying. They have to understand that the people they're electing are causing the problems that they're having. And leaving the state is not the only option. We could fix this. All of these problems are man-made. All of these problems are fixable.
100%. That's a great, simple way of putting it. The people you're electing are causing the problems you're having. I mean, it's like, that's it. So, vote a different way and the problems stop. I mean, it's simple. So I guess let's wrap it up. We're going back to where we started with this 47 cents thing. So that was next. So again, just to be really clear, that was the estimate provided in September. They withdrew it because there was an outcry. They're going to vote on November the 8th, 3 days after the election, for what it's actually going to be. But what? So the 47 cents, that was year one, right? That's just the first year, isn't it?
Well, it's all a little bit fuzzy because this is the so-called market that they've created for these fictional credits that they've invented. And nobody really knows how many credits will be generated, how many credits will be needed, what they'll have to pay in their private negotiations over them. So it's a little bit fuzzy. But the one thing we do know is that when the government makes running your engine illegal and then grants you permission if you pay for permission and buy credits for permission, this is a government-mandated scheme. This is not the market. This is not a market-based solution. This is government regulation strangling California. And everyone should understand that it doesn't have to be this way.
Exactly. Well, vote accordingly is the first point. Just a quick last one before we go today. Just an update on, I mean, it's almost like a running joke now, but in Los Angeles, there's another proposed ballot initiative raising taxes for homelessness.
Yes, another proposed tax increase for the same failed homelessness programs in Los Angeles, the same ones that are being audited right now by a federal judge has ordered an audit to see where all the money went. There was a tax passed, a 0.25% sales tax increase in 2017. It was temporary, 10 years. Well, it expires in 2027, and all the groups that get the money for these contracts, including developers who want more money for contracts, they funded an initiative to raise the sales tax even further and make the tax permanent instead of temporary and direct all the money to themselves. This is Measure A on the Los Angeles County ballot. It is a sales tax increase for the same failed homelessness programs. And yesterday, as we tape this, the mayor of Los Angeles was on television saying, oh, everyone should vote for it because there's accountability. That is ridiculous. We've already had the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, highly paid to oversee all of the spending, failed. Then we had a Blue Ribbon Commission on top of that, failed. The Blue Ribbon Commission recommended an executive committee, failed. The auditors can't even get the data that they need from these services providers. And now they want to entrench this system permanently and raise the sales tax in LA County by more than $1 billion a year. Vote no on A.
Absolutely. $1 billion. That's a lot of money. And let's just, a recap. no on all tax increases. They've got enough money. And by the way, a bond is a tax increase, only worse because it's going to be paid back over time with interest and money and fees to financial institutions. It's nearly double actually what they say. So don't let them have any more money. They've doubled the budget in the last 10 years pretty much after inflation, even though the population of the state of California has been flat or falling. They have plenty of money. They're just wasting it on things that don't make our lives better. No on Measure A, no on all the bonds, no on all the tax increases. That's like, let's at least we can try and stop that.
Exactly. You have to cut off the money, or they will never reform these programs.
Exactly. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Susan. That was great. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, joining us now for Candidate Corner, a candidate in a very important race in Southern California, Orange County, Scott Peotter. He joins us now. Scott, I'm looking at your background. For those who are listening rather than watching, I'm just going to read out what it says. You've got very good branding right behind you on your screen. It says, vote Scotty, not Cotty. So I'm sure you're going to tell us what that's about. So tell us the story. Where are you running? What's this? Who's Cotty? Tell us the whole story.
Sure. I'm running for state assembly. And of course, like you just had in your previous guest, there's 80 members in the assembly, 2-year terms. So everybody's up. This is the people's house, right? This is the one that if we don't like what's going on with the government, we can get everybody out every 2 years. We're not stuck with anybody longer than that. And I'm running against Scotty Peotter Norris. And my district is District 73. And that's Irvine, Costa Mesa, and Tustin in Orange County.
Is this your first time running? What have you been up to? What's your story?
I'm a former Newport Beach City Councilman, and I've been participating in the community for a lot of years. I've been on planning commissions and other activities, and frankly, I got tired of Sacramento, what's going on, and I threw my hat in the ring and won the primary. So here I am.
So this is your first time running for the assembly, or the state legislature generally. Okay, got it. And so what's the race? People think of Orange County, we've had many candidates on from there, some of the congressional candidates, Scott Bohr. Are you in Scott's district? Are you in the same?
Yeah, two of my cities, Costa Mesa and Irvine, overlap in Scott Bohr's congressional district.
Okay, so people get a sense of that. And so I think that, of course, that part of the state we used to think of as very Republican, and now it's more, people say purple. What does your race look like? Is it a winnable race? Is it tough for you? How are you seeing it?
It's going to be a long shot. It's one of those races, they need this district in order to get rid of the supermajority. Right now, if you have 2/3 of those 80 members, you can pretty much do whatever you want. Tax increases, whatever you want to put on the ballot, you can do it. We need, as Republicans, to take back 9 seats in order to break the supermajority, which would prevent them, if the Republicans hang together, from doing tax increases and things like that without votes of the Republicans to go along with it. So mine's one of those seats, but it's lower on the list. It's probably ironically, they would probably categorize it as the 8th or 9th seat of that 9 seats. Reality of it is, from just a pure Republican and Democratic registration, I'm like the 3rd best opportunity we've got in the state to flip the seat.
Well, it's hard, but thank goodness we have people like you out there fighting. Otherwise nothing's going to happen. We got to, and even if you make progress, to me, you got to move forward. We've got to do something about this supermajority. It's just a complete disaster.
Right.
What are you seeing on the campaign trail? What are people responding to most in terms of your message?
There's 3 things that I hit regularly. One of them is going to be the economy. Inflation is killing people. Prices are killing people. They don't differentiate necessarily, like Susan was saying, taxes versus just inflation. When they realize how much tax is on a gallon of gas, for instance, and how much it's going to continue to go up just from a tax perspective, all they know is the price of gas is too high. Same thing, crime. They don't understand that the border is causing a majority of our crime and criminal problems. 25% of our crimes are committed by illegal aliens. And if we shut the border, we could fix at least 25% of that. And we're not. All they know is that crime is now reaching into their neighborhoods. They don't like it. And then the last thing that I'm running across is parental rights. Parental rights, like what the assembly is doing in the case of parents at schools. And now they've got what I call the Don't Tell Your Parents Act, and that is if your son or daughter decides that they want to change gender, the school is going to keep it secret from you unless the student wants to tell you. And so they are under law. AB 1955 just passed, goes into effect in January. Schools will be prohibited from having a policy that would inform parents of something like that.
And do you find which of the parents? I mean, do you find parents who say, I think that's good, and we need? I mean, what's the response to that? Where is it strongest?
Anybody that's got a kid school age, they're really interested in it. There are some liberal parents that will sit there and say, how dare you? This is my decision. What are you trying to do? And the reality of it is the parents don't have a decision. And most parents understand it pretty quickly. And it goes across political spectrums.
What about let's go back to the words behind you for those who can see them. So who is Scotty? Tell us about your opponent.
Okay, so Scotty Peotter, she lives in Laguna Beach. It's not in the district, so she actually does not live in the district. She keeps an apartment there to stay legal. She has been there for 6 years, since 2018. And this is a relatively new district for her because of the redistricting that happened in 22. That's why she doesn't live in the district. But she moved there because she thought the registration advantage was to her advantage and she would have an easier time. She is, for those that are paying attention, when Newsom had his special assembly session this last week, she was the one that chaired, as the chairman of the Utilities Committee, all of the discussion about raising or requiring these refineries to stock more fuel to theoretically bring your gas prices down, which will do just the opposite.
It's the opposite, yeah. So she's a kind of Newsom lackey. Would that be a way of describing her?
I would say yes. I mean, she likes to portray herself as a moderate in the district, as do a lot of Democrats, but her voting record is very, very liberal, very much along. In fact, more liberal than Newsom in a lot of ways, because Newsom at least vetoed some of these bills that she voted for.
What about the impact of the national politics? So when in a race like and there's a lot of focus on Orange County because you've got, just broadly in your area, you've got some very, very significant, which we've covered here, and I've personally been involved in. You've got some very significant congressional races, not just Scott Paul, the opportunity to flip Katie Porter's seat, but also you've got Michelle Steele there and Young Kim, Ken Calvert not that far away. You've got a lot of money and from the whole country coming in and fighting it out in your patch. How can you I don't want to say compete against that, but how do you stand out against that? Or do you basically accept that you'll rise or fall with the kind of almost with a national level of support for Republicans or Democrats in this election?
I tend to look at it as to my advantage. Let's say, for instance, Scott Baugh's race. Scott Baugh overlaps two of my cities. Young Kim overlaps the third. And both of those candidates are going to spend literally millions of dollars getting the vote out. Every weekend when we're walking precincts, we're using the same target list that they're using because their voters are my voters. So I look at it as an opportunity to overcome my registration disadvantage because I think the Republicans are going to do a better job of getting the voters out than the Democrats. And we're already starting to see that some of the early returns as far as who's returning ballots. We don't know how they voted yet.
And so what's your focus? What do you find is most effective in terms of getting a reaction and reaching people?
Well, I like to tell people, this is how I get their attention. Scotty Peotter, her two big issues that she climbs on all the time are abortion. There's not an abortion that she doesn't like. She doesn't want to restrict any of them. And climate change. She's in favor of windmills off the coast. She wants to put wind offshore because she thinks, the wind won't die out as much. Because, hey, when you sit there and advocate these alternative energy in the name of climate change for solar and wind, sometimes the sun doesn't shine, every night, and sometimes the wind doesn't blow. So what do we do for electricity when that happens? Well, you have to build a gas plant right next door to provide electricity when sun and wind don't. So our energy costs twice as much. You talk to any friends or relatives back east, any part of the country besides here, and you're going to find their electric bills half of what ours is.
Yes. I mean, I'd have thought that's a great vulnerability because did you say she's chair of the Utilities Commission?
She is.
Committee, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so she's pushing this agenda, and I think the Democratic Party is setting her up to move on to higher office as far as giving her that kind of exposure. She is not a good legislator.
But we have the highest utility costs in the country. What's she doing about that?
Well, she is complaining about it, and she's trying to say that she's advocating for us, but her solution is to force energy providers to sell it for less, or to make sure that the gasoline refineries don't gouge us when they're shut down, which we know that, for somebody who's got a degree in Yale in economics, she doesn't have a very good handle on how economics work.
Well, because it's all ideological, isn't it? I mean, that's the point. That's what it's just a war on fossil fuels. But of course, it's not a war on fossil fuel generally. It's just a war on our fossil fuel in California, because they're happy to import it halfway across the world. We were just talking about that with Susan.
Well, I think it's more a matter of control. They want to make sure that they tell us what to do, and they're using climate change to control us.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott. So listen, tell everyone how they can get involved and what they can do to help. You've got a couple of weeks left. So what can people do?
Well, we're down to the last strokes. So donations would be great, because that means I can text more. I can send out more emails. My website is taxfighter.com. Tells you how I approach taxes. Taxfighter.com, and there's a donate button in the upper right-hand corner. That would be much appreciated. If you live in the area, we're walking precincts every Saturday. You can contact me through taxfighter.com, and I could set you up on precinct walks or phone calling, whichever is your preference.
Fantastic. Scott, we really appreciate it. Thank you for stepping up. Thank you for doing this and for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Steve. I appreciate it.
All right, everyone, that is our show for today. The election is not far away now. Things are hotting up. Exciting times if you follow politics. So make sure you follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll be back here next week for the next episode of The Steve Hilton Show.